U.S. President Joe Biden is urging all Americans to leave Ukraine immediately, saying he will not send troops to rescue Americans if Russia invades. Now, this is why the West is so alarmed. More than 100,000 Russian troops have been moved to positions close to the border with Ukraine, and Russia now has sent another 30,000 or so soldiers to Belarus, just to the north. On Thursday, Moscow and Minsk began joint live-fire drills, escalating an already tense situation.
The Russian Defense Ministry released these images of live fire drills and heavy armour, the militaries of Russia and Belarus operating as one. It's not just Ukraine that's alarmed by this show of force. In Berlin on Thursday, the leaders of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania met with Chancellor Scholz to discuss the strategic response to Moscow's aggression in the region.
Now it is more important than ever to mobilize and to defend the values that are an essential element uniting the Western allies. NATO guaranteed peace and stability for decades and made it possible to achieve collective security level that our countries enjoy today.
NATO troops are already protecting the alliance's northeastern flank in the Baltic states. In fact, soldiers like these Germans stationed in Lithuania, close to Russian territory, are part of what Vladimir Putin objects to. Germany has announced it is beefing up its deployment, sending an extra 350 Bundeswehr troops to join the mission. But Chancellor Scholz says dialogue is still the aim. We expect from Russia clear steps to reduce the current tensions in the region. We need de-escalation. At the same time, we are ready for serious dialogue with Russia on questions of European security. The Baltic countries are willing to supply lethal weapons to Ukraine, such as Javelin missile systems. In some cases, they would need the agreement of Germany, which is reluctant to see more deadly arms going into the region. But Russia's neighbours fear such qualms will be seen as weakness.
Diplomacy and genuine dialogue will have a chance only in combination with the credible deterrence and force posture. Any failure in this would send an encouraging signal to Russia and could lead to similar tactics and pressure elsewhere.
At a separate meeting in Berlin on Thursday, Ukrainian and Russian officials also sat down together for talks. The hope must be that all the diplomacy will help to prevent war.
For the very latest, let's bring in our correspondent Nick Connolly in Kiev and our chief political correspondent Melinda Crane here in Berlin. Nick, Russia's saber-rattling on Ukraine's border has become so loud that the U.S. president has urged Americans to leave the country now. How are Ukrainians coping with the threat of war?
Well, Terry, I think there was basically a phase when this crisis started late last year where there was a huge disconnect between the world's media making this the #1 story and indeed tanks being seen on the Russian side coming close to the border and all the satellite images, but it hadn't really trickled down here to ordinary Ukrainians who've often enough thought this was just another escalation of the kind they've seen time and time again in the last 8 years since Russia annexed Crimea. But I think now you really get a sense that people, even though they're keeping calm outwardly and tell you that they're, this is normal, they know that they have an issue with their northern neighbour. They will then also tell you that they've withdrawn money from bank accounts to have cash in case they need to leave in a hurry. They've delayed decisions like getting a mortgage. Some businesses are investigating setting up new offices in cities closer to the EU and NATO in western Ukraine, moving away from the Russian border. So a bit of a kind of schizophrenic disconnect there between outward calm and increasing preparations for a conflict.
Melinda, we've seen a flurry of diplomatic efforts this week aimed at ending the crisis. Has any progress been made?
Well, amongst those efforts was a German hosting yesterday of talks between Russian and Ukrainian representatives co-hosted by Germany and France. And in fact, this is the second round of such talks within just a little over 2 weeks after a very long break beforehand. This is known as the Normandy format and has as its focus the 2015 Minsk Agreement. And these talks are aimed not at resolving the current buildup of Russian forces, but at trying to address tensions and ongoing fighting in eastern Ukraine between government forces of Ukraine and pro-Russian separatists. So yesterday's talks did go on for 9 hours. No concrete outcome was reached, but German media are reporting that negotiators said the discussions were difficult, revealed deep divisions over the very substance of the agreement, but that all four parties said they absolutely want the talks to continue. And Ukraine's negotiator confirmed that the talks hadn't brought progress, but said that there had been a complete ceasefire for several days last week, which he called a strong result. So here in Berlin, that is viewed as progress.
Nick, Russia has assembled a massive army on Ukraine's borders. How is Ukraine's military preparing to defend the country?
And with difficulty, in a word, because given the fact that there are Russian troops in Belarus for those exercises, Ukraine theoretically has to prepare for a Russian intervention on a huge area from the far northwest of Ukraine on the border with Belarus and Poland to the Black Sea. And even though Ukraine's army is a lot stronger now than it was back in 2014, when Russia was basically able to pick off Crimea with little in the way of resistance, that is a scenario that most European armies wouldn't be able to deal with. On top of that, Russia has huge advantages when it comes to air power and naval power. Then there's scenarios being prepared for here in Kiev of in some kind of internal unrest, Russia trying to create some kind of pretext for an intervention with protests. So the police here are very worried that that is something that could be on the horizon. But Ukrainian officials saying that this is, after all, a country that has been at war for the last 8 years, and there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who fought in that conflict in eastern Ukraine who would be ready and with some preparation to go back to serve if an intervention were to actually take place.
Melinda, Germany has been sharply criticized for not doing more to help Ukraine militarily. Some of Germany's allies have even questioned Berlin's reliability. What is Berlin doing to address those concerns and help Ukraine?
Well, for starters, after quite a long period in which he was scarcely seen or heard on this issue, Chancellor Scholz is now sponsoring that flurry of diplomatic activity that you mentioned a moment ago. He visited Washington this week. He's going to Moscow and Kiev. And he also did host both the Normandy talks and the Baltic leaders yesterday in Berlin. And as you say, Germany has faced criticism for its reluctance to send defensive weapons to Ukraine and is sometimes accused of naivete for thinking that diplomacy alone can solve the crisis. But as we heard in the report, Germany is stepping up its contribution to deterrence on NATO's eastern flank. Scholz told Baltic leaders yesterday that Germany will send 350 additional troops to the region. And Germany is, in fact, the lead nation in NATO's operation in Lithuania. It already makes up about half the forces in a 1,200-strong multinational NATO battle group there. And in fact, Germany's the only EU member country contributing to that battle group. So I think here in Berlin, there is a sense that that is, in fact, deterrence and not simply diplomacy, and that Germany is demonstrating resolve.
Melinda, Nick, thank you both very much. Melinda Crane, our chief political correspondent, Nick Connolly, our correspondent in Kiev.